Think we're live? Are we live? Am I ready to go live? Oh, my technical difficulties shortly. Hold on. Okay. I think we're good. All right, so let's just get going. From Battleborn Progress, this is Out in Front. I'm your host, Jacob Solis. This week, we wanted to put a spotlight on question 3. For the uninitiated, this is a ballot question this fall that would, if passed, amend the state's constitution to create open primaries and ranked choice voting. Here to break down what that actually means and what we're even talking about when we talk about ranked choice, we've assembled a panel of experts. Let's see if we can get the panel now. There we are. So just to run through some names real quick, Bradley Schrager is an attorney at Bravo Schrager, where, among other things, he is quite often involved in election law cases. Bradley, how are you?
Very well, thank you. Good evening, Jacob.
Good evening to you, too. Emily Prasad Zamora is the executive director of Silver State Voices, a progressive nonprofit that, among other things, helps steer the Let Nevadans Vote Coalition, which is aimed at protecting and expanding civic access. Emily, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Jacob. Hope you're doing well.
Thanks for being here. I'm doing great. I'm peppy this evening. And finally, Carrie Dermick is the Nevada State Director for All Voting is Local, a multi-state nonpartisan organization advocating for pro-voter policies and expanding ballot access. So, Carrie, how are you?
Yeah, I'm doing great. How are you doing? Thanks so much for having me.
I'm doing great. And you know what? Let's get right into it. And before we start, I guess for the viewers at home, we should probably start with a little primer on what question 3 is and what exactly it does, because a lot of the conversation tonight is going to center around the nitty-gritty stuff. So, okay, everyone has to bear with me because this is a lot of words, but we're just going to power through it. So, when we say open primaries, more specifically Nevada's primary elections, which right now are closed primaries, right? You have to be a registered Republican or Democrat to participate in a Republican or Democratic primary, and just that. This would make it an open top 5 primary. So everyone runs in the same office, in the same primary, and the top 5 vote getters advance to the general. From there, ranked choice voting takes over. So for congressional races, state level executive, think like the governor and the lieutenant governor and the treasurer and all that. And then state legislative races, voters rank those 5 candidates for each race. Then any candidate with a simple majority wins outright. And if there's no majority, then the candidate with the fewest votes is removed. Anyone who voted for that candidate as a first choice has those votes redistributed to their second choice, and then you check to see if someone has a simple majority. You rinse and repeat this process until somebody finally wins all of those races. Because this is a proposed constitutional amendment, it has to be approved by voters in 2 successive elections. So it already narrowly passed once in 2022. So passing again in 2024 would make this the law of the land in Nevada. Okay. I need to breathe, but we're going to start with you, Bradley. After all that, what's so wrong with question 3?
What's so wrong with it? You know, I always try to put things in their best light when I'm considering them. And so I first want to say there are lots of different ways you can structure the way we vote, right? And the ways in which we cast ballots have changed many, many times over the years. I mean, a lot of people don't realize we didn't even have secret ballots until the late 19th century. Secret ballots didn't show up everywhere until after World War II. The ways in which we vote are always changing. But when you make changes of this level, you know, there are going to be drawbacks that are going to show up as impacts upon voting communities, and we should talk about them honestly. And that's something that I think has been missing so far. This is very clearly going to make voting more complicated, even for those people that were able to follow exactly what you just said, Jacob. They would probably need to run back through it a few times. Now, that doesn't mean that over time people wouldn't get used to this notion, but it is clearly going to make things more complicated to exercise what is a fundamental constitutional right of casting your ballots. And the proponents of this have said, well, look, we're just adding more choice. You make choices when you go to the grocery store. You make choices about what toppings you're going to put on your pizza. But I don't think that democracy can be reduced to a trip to the grocery store or a night at your pizzeria, right? It's if I choose the wrong topping, I simply have something else to eat. I don't get stuck with years worth of policy from folks I didn't want to be elected. And anytime you make these kinds of things more complicated, if you make registering to vote more complicated, you're going to have fewer successful registrations. If you make counting the ballots more difficult, you're going to have more errors and more time-consuming counting of the ballots. Anytime these things become more complex, there's going to add in difficulties and problems in the process. And one of my questions for the folks that are running this is this the moment we want to be treating balloting as a sort of laboratory at the moment when our democracy is at its most fragile that it has been in, obviously decades, where so much is riding on the outcome of elections. Furthermore, studies have shown that ranked choice voting and open primaries lead to an increase in voter error. We've all moved to paper ballots in the last two general elections. It used to be about 10% of our ballots were cast on paper. Now it's upwards of 60. We used to have 3-4% of the ballots would have errors. Now it's gone over 5%, and it's been shown that when folks have to do ranked choice voting, you can get up to 10 times as many errors. And historically, in the few races we have data on this, that has affected communities of color and economically disadvantaged communities more than other communities, more affluent communities. And once again, I'd ask, is this the moment when this is something we want to be trying, this sort of experiment? And we can talk later on about the supposed benefits that the proponents are saying this would bring to us. And we can talk about whether or not we think those are valid and whether they're accurate. But, just on the things that are potentially major flaws, it feels like this may be the wrong time to be choosing what is essentially a new scheme that everyone's going to have to learn and deal with the fallout from. It's also, they've also, if you look at this, it sort of looks like a statute, but these proponents have chosen to put it into the Constitution for whatever reason. That means obviously it's harder to get into, as you mentioned, it has to be passed twice. But if it's not something we're all thrilled with, it's incredibly difficult to get out of the Constitution. We'll be stuck with it for a while, and we don't have decades worth of races and hundreds of elections elsewhere that can tell us, sort of what the effect is over time of ranked choice voting in these races. There's really very, very few. So we're sort of flying blind here. So for all those reasons, there's a sense that we're sort of rushing into something that is being sort of foisted upon us in a way that is just not necessarily being thought out properly at this particular moment in our history.
Exactly. Many questions to be answered. And certainly that was an incredibly thorough answer. And let's pick apart all of it. And I'm going to go back to the beginning, where I think something you brought up and something that was brought up the first time that this was on the ballot, and something that's obviously coming up against now. And Emily, I'll kick this to you, is that this could affect different voters differently, right? If we're talking about, how engaged those communities are, whether or not they speak English as a first language, whether or not they're white or not, right? All of these factors play into how this sort of institutional change could impact literally different kinds of voters. I guess let's start with you, Emily. When we talk about how voters could be impacted differently by this, what are we talking about? What sense do you have of the way that this could impact people?
I think it's a variety of different factors when we talk about the potential impact, right? I think there's the impact on actually understanding, right? Our ballot in the state of Nevada is pretty simple. It's organized by the hierarchy of different positions, and you have your candidates. You circle in if you're on a vote by mail ballot, or you just click on it if you're using a voting machine, right? I think one of the things that really comes into play is this ballot initiative is only for certain types of positions, right? So most of the federal, with the exception of the presidency, state legislature, state constitutional offices. But in elections, there are a variety of different positions that are on a ballot. And so if we were to say that this were going into effect in 2026, voters would be voting for constitutional offices and they would be using a ranked choice voting. But there are several school board positions that are also going to be on the ballot, and those would not be going through a ranked choice voting. So unless voters really understand the letter of the statute, right, and working with a grassroots organizations, a lot of everyday voters don't really understand the policy behind things, right? And so if they're getting their ballot, they're probably going to be confused as to, like, why do I have to vote for certain positions in this manner and other positions in this manner? And that when there is all of those questions, that can lead to a deep distrust as to, well, why do things have to be this particular way? And so I think that's one of the things that we have been hearing from a lot of community members, that is a potential concern that they have. I think in the level of confusing as well, the Democratic Party here in the state of Nevada, they tried out the ranked choice voting in their caucus in 2020. And a lot of the feedback that folks gave is, this is very confusing. How do I know? Do I have to pick all 5 people? What if I only really care about 1 or 2 people? Do I have to actually choose additional candidates? And these are all things that, if folks are not properly educated on how the process actually works, can mean that if they are casting their ballot and don't fill it out properly, that their ballot could potentially be spoiled and not counted in an election. And we have seen that things like this have happened in different municipalities in states that do have ranked choice voting. And the communities that suffer the most when it comes to spoiled ballots is communities of color, especially Black and Latino voters.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, how soon we forget 2020. So many things. But on that point, and on that point you were just making now, I actually want to dig deeper and look at some of the election administration issues that could arise from this. Because when we talk about spoiled ballots, I mean, part of this, right, certainly is the voters being confused and having trouble filling out the ballot correctly while they're doing it. But obviously, there's increased pressure, right, on actual election workers. Many of them volunteers, right? These clerks' offices are already understaffed and underpaid. So, Carrie, I want to ask you: do we have a good sense of how a change like this would actually affect election workers in Nevada? County clerks' offices. Are they prepared for this kind of change?
Yeah, so I would say, this ballot measure is going to extremely impact our election departments across the state, because if we do implement ranked choice voting across our state, it's going to require funding for more staff. I would say probably hundreds of more staff, because this is going to be a lot more complicated system in order to tabulate and count ballots due to the process that Bradley explained earlier. And then I think, the implementation alone, I think a conservative estimate right now is 3.2 million. So that's just to implement this. That's not the yearly cost of what this will cost every single year. So I think that's an extreme cost on taxpayers just to implement this new system. And then I think education, like to Emily's point, there are going to be some races like school board that are not going to be in the ranked choice voting system. And there'll be the constitutional offices that will be. I think that's going to be extremely confusing, and it's going to take a lot of education, not just within our county clerks and our state of like the county clerks and the Secretary of State's office, but also like within our own organizations. We'll have to be doing this education as well too. And so I think that is going to be really, really complicated. And then I think the other issue that we're facing is since 2020, we've had at least a dozen county clerks and registrars resign or retire. And so we've lost decades of institutional knowledge. And so I think with that loss of institutional knowledge and then doing a complete rehaul on our election system in a time where our democracy is extremely fragile, I don't think is a best case scenario at this point. And I think it's going to put extreme pressure not only on our election workers and the Secretary of State's office and our county clerks and registrars, but also on Nevada's democracy.
Right, right. One thing to say that we're going to make all these changes, another things to actually have the county clerks do all of it. Carrie, a quick follow up. I wanted to ask you because to what degree, I mean, let me start here, right? Everyone at home we all know that we switched to, all mail ballots in
Mhm.
2020. And now we've seen sort of now successive elections through 2022 and now through 2024. We're seeing it again. Sort of, we're all getting used to it. We're
Yeah.
all finally sort of getting used to the fact that we're getting it in the mail. I personally love to vote by mail, or I drop it right off in the precinct, right? I'd love that. Anyways, it took this long, right, to get to a point where we're starting to, get used to it. But even then, right, people still struggle with signature curing. Particular communities might struggle with signature curing. Even, and like you say, the county clerks have to struggle with the actual, vote counting process. No one will ever forget Nevada being a meme in 2020 for taking so long to count the votes.
Mhm.
So what lessons can we learn from the transition to all mail ballots and apply to maybe look forward in the way that, like, okay, how can we extrapolate that out to how RCV could impact these same systems?
Yeah. I mean, so I think with like the vote by mail implementation, so that came about because of a deadly pandemic, right? And so I think in 2020 there was extreme pressure put on our election departments across the state, but it was necessary because of the situation we're in. And then I think the state legislator did a great job with ironing out a lot of the implementation issues that we saw in 2020. And then I also think that Secretary Aguilar's office really pushed for outreach funding in the 2023 legislative session and actually has outreach funding now to actually educate more Nevadans about vote by mail, about the curing process. And so I think we've come a long way since 2020. I think my concern with the ranked choice voting implementation is I feel that this could take even double the time for people to get used to it, maybe even triple. And I think another major concern is what Bradley and Emily were saying earlier, is that there's an increase in spoiled ballots. There's an increase in votes not counting because people didn't fill out their ballots correctly. And I think also the thing we have to think about is with the vote by mail system is how will ranked choice voting work on a vote by mail ballot where everybody's ballots be 50 pages long. And then also, are you going to be able to cure your ballot if you did not fill out it correctly? Or is that only going to be signature curing? Like, I think there's a lot of questions that we have to ask that go into the implementation of this. And then, like, additionally, I really think there needs to be a large case to be made that vote by mail has vastly increased accessibility. We saw historic voter turnout in 2020 in every single demographic across the state. It didn't matter if you lived in Las Vegas or if you lived in Pahrump. Like, people were and are still using vote by mail. And I think that really speaks to why it's so popular and why we still have it in this state. I don't think at this point that same case can be made for ranked choice voting. I am fairly certain like we're not going to have it be more accessible for like an everyday Nevada voter.
Absolutely. And I'm going to go off script now with a question. I'm going to kick it to you, Bradley, because something that's come up in all of this that I want to get an
I
answer
was
to
going to add
now.
one thing. I was
Oh,
going to
no,
add one
go
thing to
for
what
it.
Carrie
Yeah,
said.
please
And
interrupt.
before we move on to the next thing,
Yeah.
because what Carrie's saying is so crucially important on a sort of practical level of how these elections are going to be run and the stresses we're going to find in there. But, Jacob, you brought up both signature curing and voters getting used to mail. Nevada remains a highly transient state, so we're continually having to or sort of educate anew folks who are coming into our system. But right now, the sort of single greatest error we are seeing voters make has to do with their signatures. Right, that's by far the sort of highest number of errors, and the clerk's offices, the political parties run massive cure operations so that these people's votes can be counted, so their choices can be heard. We are, through ranked choice voting, will be introducing a category of error that may in fact dwarf the sort of types of errors we see now by sheer numbers, and they will be uncurable. Right, those votes will be thrown away; they'll be wasted. So you'll be adding to the signature problem this whole other category that people are going to have to deal with that cannot be cured, and that's a further problem. I'm sorry. Please go ahead with your.
No, and I mean to that point. Well, actually, not to that point because I don't want to lose the question I was going to ask right before you said that. So, I guess hard pivot, and we've got some questions in the chat, and we will get to them. But first, I did want to ask about the sort of like why of this all, right? Why question 3? Why now? And I think something we've seen certainly in the literature on the pro question 3 side, and I think in the general culture, right, is a dissatisfaction with the way that American elections work. And I think specifically in Nevada, and to a point you just made, Bradley, right, there's lots of nonpartisan voters in Nevada, right? About a third of the electorate are registered nonpartisans. But to your point about Nevada being transient, a lot of those nonpartisans are just people who go to the DMV for a new driver's license and don't mark any party, and then they become nonpartisan. So they're not necessarily politically engaged one way or the other to begin with. Who knows how long they'll be in Nevada, for instance. Now, all of that said, I think a lot of people are frustrated with the race for the presidency. I'm not going to talk about, who is actually running or anything right now about that. Just a fact of the matter that people want more options for president. It is a rematch of 2020, c'est la vie. And this question 3 has nothing to do with the presidency. It has everything to do with Congress, Senate, House races, state legislative races, and the governor's office. And to what degree, I guess, is there a sense that like the complaints people have about American democracy or Nevadans have about Nevada's democracy would be addressed by question 3?
Now that's an incredibly incisive question, which sort of gets to the heart of this, which is the why. It's if obviously there is great levels of dissatisfaction out there regarding something having to do with our society. I don't know necessarily that it's with democracy or with the machinery of democracy. I mean, when I hear people being upset about their lives or inflation or partisanship or whatever it is, I don't necessarily hear that it has to do with the way my ballot is printed or the way that I get to vote. But if I can sort of speak to what the proponents at least say they're doing with these things, because there's these 2 major changes, which are not necessarily connected, but they're 2 major changes. There's the open primary, and then there's the ranked choice voting. Now, with the open primary, you spoke about nonpartisans, and that's really what the proponents have been focusing on. Almost the entirety of their campaign and their rhetoric last time had to do with providing a voice to nonpartisan voters who are not allowed to vote at the moment in our closed party primaries. Now, on some level, that's a perfectly defensible, legitimate position to take, right? If you want to say that that everyone should have a voice in who's being nominated, but then that sort of takes the meaning out of being nominated, right? I mean, the opposite of that is if you do care, or if you do believe that political parties have a role in how you structure politics in your society, which is a sort of form of organizing, right? And you may or may not think that's true. But if you do believe that, then you may be less inclined to think that nonpartisans or people of the other party, Republicans, should be helping to determine how far a Democratic nominee gets in the process, or vice versa, whether Democrats should be deciding that for members of the Republican Party. It sort of takes the meaning out of being a member of those parties. Now, if that's what they're after, the sort of dissolution of parties as a force in our political society, that's also fine, but they should be saying that a little more obviously, because I think this is designed to have a corrosive effect on political parties. Whether you're for that or you're against that, that's up to you. But I think that's true. The second aspect of this initiative, the ranked choice voting, does not seem to have that same sort of, hey, let's stand up for folks who need to have a voice. It seems to be more of just a sort of a technocratic innovation. And if I had to guess, if I were looking long term, I would say that the long term goal of this is to push, I suppose, politics toward the center, right? It's sort of meant to slice off the right and the left and funnel politics towards a center. Now, you may be a centrist. You may think that's awesome. You may not be. But I think that's probably the underlying force behind all these things, is that there's a desire to shape politics without doing politics that's sort of built into this thing. I mean, there's this notion that if you give nonpartisans more voice in nominations, let's call it, or who gets to a general election. And when you get to that general election, there's this newfangled way of ranking that will result in a new sort of candidate winning, or a type of candidate winning. You are trying to sort of shape candidates and politics in a way that's true to some sort of vision. They won't really say what that vision is. I don't necessarily know that I share that vision, whatever it is, because I can't really discern it. But I think that's sort of where it is. And if you want to talk about, who's behind this and how much money they're spending and all those sorts of things, I'm sure we'll get to that. But that sort of plays into this. But there's a project going on here that is going to be corrosive of the bounds of political parties, and is going to lead toward certainly more candidates. I don't necessarily know that it's going to be better candidates. You're going to have 5 on the ballot as opposed to several. You're going to have dozens of candidates in the primaries. They're all going to be spending an awful lot of money. This is not going to have absolutely no effect on the amount of money in politics. It's probably a worse effect on money in politics than we have now. So, that's really I don't know that anything I've said, even from their point of view, sort of recommends this to people as a way of now structuring our electoral process.
Well, yeah, and to that, something you said, right, that's really struck me. If you go and read the text of question 3, you go on the Nevada Secretary of State's website, it really does read like something that was cooked up in a lab, right? No aspersions on things that were cooked up in labs. But Emily, to what degree rather do we have a sense that regular voters understand what question 3 is even asking in the first place? Like, does the median voter understand what a closed primary is and how like the current system works? And if they do or don't, do they have a good sense of how this would work?
The answer is no to both of your questions, right? Like, the average voter, unfortunately, is not well educated into all of the intricacies of the electoral process. And I think, going to a little bit back into what Bradley was saying, I think that's one of the very disappointing aspects of this campaign. In 2022, they really just fed off of this narrative that there's a growing amount of nonpartisans, and all of the messaging, every single ad, mailer, text message, anything that the campaign did was only focused on open primaries. Why? That's strategically was decided upon because they know that the average voter does not understand what ranked choice voting is. And once voters do start educating themselves, they read up on what the actual process is, they are confused and don't feel comfortable knowing that this could be an actual possibility in how they would cast their next ballot. And so I think that that's a little bit being dishonest, as many of our partners decided that we did not want to support this initiative because it's not being honest to the voters as to what is included in the ballot initiative and what the totality of the impacts are.
Absolutely. And I guess to the way that voters understand the thing, I wanted to quickly, before we move on to some other topics, ask you, Carrie, how, we've talked a little bit about spoiled ballots, right? And what happens on the back end, right? If someone fills out a ballot wrong, that it's just not going to get used. I guess, do we have any examples either in Nevada, right? I know we talked a little bit about the 2020 Democratic caucus here, but certainly in other states, do we have ideas of what these kinds of failure rates are? Because it's certainly right. It's one thing to say that, people won't get it, people will mess up their ballots, but like, are there things that we can point to that give us this idea in the first place?
Yeah, so definitely some research has come out because in places like Alaska and Maine, like they've implemented this statewide, but then also cities like Minneapolis and New York City are doing this at a citywide level. So I think one example was there were in Minneapolis, for example, like nearly 10% of ranked choice voting ballots were not counted, and most of these were coming from low-income communities of color. So I think that's one example. And then another example that we've seen is in New York City, nearly 15% were not counted in the final tally. And then these two are not like outliers. We've seen this time and time again. And then I think the other thing that we're seeing, which is particularly worrisome for Nevada, because we're already fighting against this, is ranked choice voting is actually causing lower turnout. So on average, we're seeing 3 to 5% lower turnout in places that are implementing ranked choice voting. And I think that's very concerning, because I think in 2020, with the historical turnout that we did see because of all of the implementation of the pro-voter legislation and laws, and of course, like the automatic vote by mail system, I think that was extremely exciting and rewarding that we're trending in the correct direction and making sure that voters have accessibility to be able to vote and choices to be able to vote. I think it's extremely concerning if we're going to go backwards by passing question 3.
Absolutely. And I mean, talking about, 10% or 15% of voters having their ballots thrown out, or obviously reduced turnout. Some of these races, obviously, it's easy to think of the way a Senate race or a gubernatorial race could be affected by something like RCV. But certainly regular state house races, I mean, I can think of at least a couple off the top of my head that were decided by a couple dozen votes, or sometimes less than 10 votes, right? This is not something that happens infrequently.
I think a good example is County Commission District C. So in 2020, that race was decided by 10 votes. So if you think about 10% or 15% of those ballots being spoiled and being thrown out, that completely changes the landscape of that race. And so I think that's really concerning when we look at races like that in the future. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, switching gears again, so this is something that Bradley, you brought up earlier, so I'll go to you first, and that is the sort of the how to the how do we get here question, right? How do we get here involves money, because this is politics. Of course, it involves money, and I wanted to ask about who's funding question 3, because there are some grassroots elements, but a lot of it has come from PAC money, and PAC money that's been funded from out of state interests. So I guess just to what degree do we have a sense of how this came about in the first place?
Yeah. I mean, it's this has the feeling of a test run here in Nevada, because and oftentimes folks who are looking to have national projects will test run them through ballot measures here in Nevada, because it's a small state compared to a place like Florida or Pennsylvania. Putting something on the ballot could cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Here, the signature gathering thresholds are less. So I think that Nevada was targeted for economic reasons and for logistical reasons, but it was certainly targeted. You mentioned sort of grassroots here. I don't really know that I see a lot of those shoots here. This is not something that I think has been is sort of welling up with a that people are clamoring for. Prior to this popping up as a campaign, I had never heard anybody mention this as, boy, if we only had that, things would be so much better in this state. But last time, the proponents put about $20 million into this. Almost all of that came from 3 or 4 individuals from out of state. This is a particular project of particular individuals doing this, and their organizations. This is not some sort of homegrown Nevada thing. I think Stations Casino was the only sort of local major on-board sponsor of this, and they didn't put in much more than their name. But $20 million was what they put into this, and they'll have to put another 30 or so into it this time. So we're talking about $50 million to tinker with the machinery of Nevada elections. Now, the way I look at it is, if you were looking at the world right now, and you were a person of good faith, and you wanted to fix things that were wrong with our democracy, and you had $50 million, but you're not putting it into voter registration, you're not putting it into fighting disinformation, you're not putting it into any of those things, you're putting it into this, right? That sort of strikes me as highly misguided priorities. But if you ask me about sort of how the campaign went last time, $20 million, lot of organized opposition, right? This was not a 20 million versus 20 million sort of thing. I think the opposition raised $1.5 million maybe and did some outreach, but very, very little. And this thing passed by 52 or 53
to 53 to 47, right. I think. Yeah,
that's right. Well, I mean, in Nevada, I've done a lot of ballot measures. If your first poll comes back with 53%, you fold up your tent and you go home, right? That is not a very positive result for the second time around. When I think that the opposition will be much more well funded and organized. So, I mean, if I were the folks running this thing, and they've obviously gone through, or from what I can tell, they've gone through some reorganization, but they're still going to have plenty of money because, once in, always in. You put $20 million in, you're not going to stop now. But I mean, I would be very sensitive to the fact that I didn't do better the first time around with such a monetary advantage. But this is clearly coming from folks who have an interest in this, but are not. I mean, let's just be clear, they ain't from around here, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and to that point, and I guess just to add some historical context to this, with ballot questions, I can think of a handful off the top of my head where, there are constitutional amendments or they needed to pass twice or what have you, right? And it's always that first election is the easy one because no one's ever running against it. I think of the energy market deregulation, right? I remember this. That might also have been question 3 because everything is question 3.
It was question 3.
It was.
There you go. Right. But like NV Energy was like, oh, we're not going to touch it. And then when it came around the second time, they're like, actually, we do want to touch it. And then it was annihilated. And so so with all that in mind, right, that first election is the easy one and they only got 53%. So is that indicative? I guess let me ask a broader question. What is that indicative of? What do we take away from that number from 2022? And for anybody, whoever wants to hop in. If no one's hopping in, I'm going to assign it out. Emily, we'll go with you.
I'll say that, what it shows to us is that with unlimited resources that they had, they barely passed, right? Like if I'm looking at an academic in a school sense, that's a barely pass with all of the resources that they had. And so what I anticipate is that this time around, there will need to be a lot more work on the no side to be able to really get ahead of the message and really educate voters around why the multitude of different reasons why this is bad. But Jacob, if you don't mind, I want to go back to your previous question around the money, because I think the other part of this, right, is that a lot of the supporters of this bill really frame this RCV and this overall ballot initiative to be a very progressive issue and a progressive policy. But if you actually follow the money as to who's contributing to this ballot initiative, it is really clear that this money is not coming from folks that have progressive values. And so like one of the Catherine Murdoch, right, Rupert, the multi-billionaire who's a media mogul, who's very conservative, she gave $2.5 million to the previous campaign. There's also like Kenneth Griffin, who's a huge GOP donor as well, that gave $3 million. And so I think it's really important for voters to know that they should just not be listening to the narrative that folks may be creating, but following the money as to who's giving money and why they're particularly giving money. And Bradley is 1000% on the idea that there is a huge push by these folks to be giving money because they want to see more moderates into office. And I'm not saying that the folks locally, that's what they particularly want, but those that are actually orchestrating the campaign, that's what they want. And I'm not sure about y'all, but what has more moderates done for any of us?
Certainly. So I guess for now, if any viewers rather have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll take them as they come. So feel free to start throwing them in there. But for now, there is, to our current discussion now. I think Emily just answered a lot of that. So I did want to ask though, and this is to your point, Emily, maybe that, we got a question that was, how do you reconcile some of, everything we've been talking about for the last 40 minutes with, allies who are progressive and for RCV? What would you say to that?
I think that at the end of the day, when we as a community look at policy, we really have to ask ourselves, is this in the best interest of our community, right? I think what's interesting about this ballot initiative is that, like, on the no side, there's the Democratic parties against it, the Republican parties against it. But coming from a nonpartisan entity that leads and works with grassroots organizations, like, we're against this because we know that this is not in the best interest of the everyday Nevadan, right? The everyday Nevadan wants to participate in the electoral process, but their priority is putting food on the table, getting their kids to school, right? Making sure that they're meeting all their doctor's appointments. And voting has to be as easy and accessible for them. And we know that implementing a system like ranked choice voting is not going to be easy for them.
And I think, look, you've actually hit on it exactly, Emily. And I think that the way to reconcile this sort of sense that there's a progressive sort of thread in this is that it's being presented as against partisanship. There's a feeling that it's somehow anti-establishment. And if you are a lifelong holder of opinions that are outside of the central zone that sort of makes up the establishment of each party, you are likely to have felt alienated over the years. And so something that would that would counter the sort of power in our politics of those parties may seem attractive. That's perfectly understandable. But I also think that's what the proponents have been playing on, and that really explains the sort of results from 2022. That's really what they're trying to emphasize here, is that you can fight back against the parties by doing this, but they're not offering any real alternative politics. There's nothing progressive in the politics of it. It's simply anti-party, I guess, is the way. It's anti-party with nothing else.
Yeah, and I would really lean into those studies where they're showing 10, 15% of ballots being spoiled. I mean, I think that says it all right there. How is that a progressive value for our state? And then I really think, like, the downgrade of the turnout, the 3 to 5% on average, with turnout going down instead of going up, I really think that will turn a lot of people off to this, because the no side has been only talking about open primaries and not what ranked choice voting is and how it will be implemented in the state of Nevada. I think that's a huge concern as well too.
Yeah, absolutely. It's some degree of what do they say? Who benefits? Cui bono, right? Miss, Latin. Our lawyer, resident lawyer in the. But so to a legal question, yes. If RCV was to pass, how long would it take to go into law?
There would need to be legislation passed to facilitate it, probably in the 2025 session. So it is designed to be in place for the 2026 primaries and general election.
And so the 26 primaries being the June primaries, right? Because it wouldn't affect the presidential. Or wait, it's 2026. What am I saying? Look.
That's right. No, it would be further. And I want to talk a second about something practical, because when I play out the scenario of what our primaries and our general look like in 2026, if this passes, let me just spin this out for a second. And I want to use let's use the Cortez Masto versus Laxalt race from last time as our base. Now, when you're going into this primary and you're either of those candidates, you can't afford. You're essentially having to face your opponent twice. You can't afford to finish third in this primary. Your consultants are going to have a fit. Your donors are going to dry up. You can't finish third or fourth. You can't just say, if I just get into the top 5, I'll find my way when it comes around to November. So the money that's going to have to be generated in the primary will be akin to a general election, which means that our mailboxes will be filled just as much and just as early, whether there's multiple Republicans and multiple Democrats. The bitterness will start earlier and last longer and be multi-pronged with all the different opponents. This isn't going to necessarily improve politics. It's going to multiply politics in ways that I think are not being explained to people, and in ways that I don't think are going to be particularly pleasant. All the things we hate about politics right now will be exaggerated under this regime.
Absolutely. I mean, if we think about even the way that this primary cycle has worked out for all of the state candidates, right? I think it's really only been in maybe the last month and a half that ads have started to hit TV, that you've really started to see mailers pick up. So in this RCV reality, I mean, we're talking. If you already think that election season lasts too long, I mean, get ready, buckle up if RCV passes. Okay, I think that's it for viewer questions for now. We still have a couple minutes left, so if any viewers out there still have questions, feel free to throw them in there. But something I did want to ask, is the way that we can think about the question of digging deeper into how voters are affected and which voters are affected. I think, because we've talked a little bit about how voters of color might be disproportionately affected. And I'm wondering, is there a degree to which, I guess, let's go back to, I said it flippantly earlier, but I'll say it seriously now. I mean, who is this for? What voter benefits most from an RCV election regime, And I guess we'll start with you, Carrie. Do you have a sense of this?
I mean, I would say, like what we've been saying this whole time, this really is going to be more dedicated to the moderate voter. And I think also what we haven't spoken about is, I do think, though, in this system, what we could see is less people of color win political office, because I think that's what we've seen in some of the other studies as well too. And so I think that's a concern, is we're going to see less diversity in our elected officials across the state, and a more moderate candidate win the election. So I think that's pretty concerning when we're talking about, when other people are talking about that this is a progressive system. I'm not sure that that's the case in any way. Yeah.
Emily, I guess same question.
I'm just shaking my head mentally, because I'm just like, this is, Nevada's the third most diverse state in the country after the 2020 census. And to think that we could be going backwards in like the level of diversity of candidates, I think is saddening. But I think Carrie's exactly right. I think that like this is really dedicated to like the white moderate voter, because I think that one of the biggest concerns, like when we're talking about the level of diversity and access of RCV, is that of like language access, right? And I think if you look at the states, there are only 2 states that have ranked choice voting implemented on a statewide basis. That's Alaska and that's Maine. And no offense to those states, but they are definitely not what we think about when we think about diversity, right? And kind of going into one of the things that we have to really be intentional about when we're thinking about election advocacy around policy is what are going to be the ramifications for counties and election departments when we're talking about preparing election materials, right? In the state of Nevada, there are 3 counties that have mandates around, there are 2 that federally have the mandate in providing election materials in different languages. In Clark County, we must provide materials in English, Spanish, and Tagalog. In Nye County, they have to provide materials in Shoshone, and Washoe County also offers materials in Spanish. And so, through our work in just explaining to voters in Spanish, for example, what ranked choice voting is, we had to call like our counterparts in New York to say to ask, because it was very confusing. We saw different states refer to it in a variety of different ways, right? And so that's just the term itself, like ranked choice voting. And I think that's something that just folks are not exactly really thinking about, that it can be a detriment in providing access to certain communities if there is a level of confusion as to like what just the proper terminology is in these policies.
And Bradley, I'll pose the same question, but with a little bit of a twist, because, and this was brought up in the chat, which is why I'm thinking of it, is that you've got all of these, you got to rank all your choices for all of these races, and that takes time. And voting already takes time. I crack open my mail ballot at home, and I spend the evening with that thing. You crack open a bottle of wine and sit down. So with ranked choice, I mean, I don't want to say who has the time for it, but will this matter more for voters who have the time to spend with a ballot of this length?
Yeah, I mean, on some level, on a sort of practical me and the ballot level, this is about high information and the leisure to study and take the time. And to one of Carrie's points was like, there's a drop off in voting because it's now a daunting process. It's a daunting pain in the ass, as opposed to of sort of easy free expression. I mean, imagine standing at the voting screen, right? The sort of in-person voting while somebody goes through a ballot like this and does this electronically for the first time or the second time, right? That's going to be, those are the kind of practical ramifications that I don't think anyone is really focusing on right now. But Jacob, you asked a minute ago, who was the voter that this is really designed for? Mm-hmm. I think I have an answer. In a solidly Democratic district, county, wherever it is, or a solidly Republican one, let's just do it from the Democratic side. You're going to wind up with the Democrat that is most acceptable to the Republicans. If that sounds like something you want, this is for you, right? That is that just on its face, that doesn't appeal to me. But if that's something, if that's your selling point, that the person who's elected should be broadly acceptable to the people who I disagree with 180 degrees, and that's your notion of consensus. Look, I'm all for consensus. I'm against manufacturing consensus out of thin air, right? Consensus is hard work. Politics is hard work. One of the reasons why this thing offends me so, and I'll actually just get down to it, is that it appears to be this sort of push button solution to problems in our democracy, rather than realizing that actual politics is about organizing and blood, sweat, and tears over years of policy fights. And that's where consensus and results come from, not from thinking, oh, if we just change the structure of our ballot, things will get better. That's really what's the sort of source of my problem with this, is that it's being sold as a way to fix something when it clearly cannot. It's avoiding politics.
Absolutely. Well, I'll take this opportunity because we've only got about 5 minutes left. So you remind me, Bradley, that everyone should have a little closing remark if they want it. So we'll kick it to you, Emily. I guess, is there anything else you'd like to say?
I think just plain and simple, I think that voters really just need to do their research as to what are all of the aspects of this ballot initiative. A point that I did want to just mention really quickly around cost, right? I think that Carrie talked a lot about election workers and election departments. And one of the biggest struggles that they have been experiencing recently is that of costs, and that elections, because of the nature of elections since the 2020 election, have really just become more and more expensive to run. And one of the things in our work in the last legislative session that we really had to deal with is the cost of paper and the paper shortages that are happening. And so one of the things that we've just really thought about deeper is, especially with more and more Nevadans using vote by mail, this is going to be an additional burden on the elections department because the cost of paper is more expensive and there's a shortage of it, right? We had multiple counties prior to the passage of AB 192 from Assemblywoman Gonzalez say that they were dropped by their vendors because their contracts weren't like big enough. And so if we're really thinking about ensuring that we're having the best overall ecosystem for our election registrars, doing something like this is just going to be another cost that they currently do not have the ability to cover.
Right. One thing to say it, another thing to do it. Carrie, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Yeah. I think just to extend on that point a little bit, I think one of the most challenging things that we're facing right now is training poll workers, because the issue is we're having to recruit new poll workers every single election year, every single cycle. So like, I think this year, like a good example is like Douglas. So Douglas usually has 100 poll workers. They only had 40 for the presidential primary because of they weren't able to find enough. So if we think about this, so it's not just about the voters being confused. If a voter is confused at a polling place, will that poll worker be able to explain this to them? And I think that is a particular concern that I have, because if you have to retrain a new person every single election, that is going to get extremely costly and honestly like just exhausting. And I think that our election departments across the state are already under extreme pressure and stress and doing the absolute best they can to be heroes of democracy right now. And so I really think we want to think about it from that perspective too, and making sure that we are creating a good ecosystem for democracy and for our election departments and county clerks across the state.
Absolutely. And you know what? Probably no better place to end than there. Thank you, everyone, for staying with us through this hour on this beautiful Thursday afternoon. Thanks so much to our guests, Bradley, Emily, Carey. You can, you know what? I think that's it. I think we're done. Have a great evening, everyone.